All right, we're live. Well, welcome everyone to Being Patient's Patient Perspectives. This is Nicholas, reporter with Being Patient, and today we have Nia Mo with us today to speak about her journey living with early onset Alzheimer's, and she was diagnosed with the disease in 2017 at the age of 42. And so, thank you so much, Nia, for joining us. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
my pleasure. And yeah, Nia, you're a veteran, and I wanted to ask you to start off our interview and ask you, what motivated you to join the U.S. Air Force in the first place, and what was that experience like for you?
Oh, it was great because I spent 22 years in the Air Force. So that was my entire adult life. I went in when I was 19. And I went in because I was working 2 jobs and had student loans that I was racking up. And I had 2 uncles in the Army that told me, go into the Air Force, not into the Army. And although I wasn't going to stay in for very long, I ended up staying in for the long haul. And I loved every minute of it.
And what did you do in the Air Force? What was your job over the years?
I was a health administrator by trade, but I loved being a first sergeant, and that's what I retired doing. And the first sergeant's job is people, making sure that the people can accomplish the mission.
Right. So as a first sergeant, you were managing people and making sure that they got their jobs done and right, and getting the operations done, right, to get the mission done.
Yes, but from a welfare perspective, like making sure that their well-being was okay, their finances, their health, their personal lives, things like that, so that they could accomplish the mission.
Right, like you're the person who was taking care of the soldiers, right? You were the
yes.
Right. Got it. And yeah, so as we talked about before this interview, some of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's that you began to experience was when you were still working at the Air Force. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those early symptoms at work, and what was that like for you?
It was hard because I felt like I was working double hard to keep up. Probably my last 2 years in the military, besides working very hard and making mistakes on paperwork and missing meetings, I had a lot of mood swings. I was very moody. Looking back, I had a very understanding commander that helped me, and chief that helped me through it. And I owe a lot to them. My last year or 6 months in the military, I absolutely do.
Right, and that was when you were still when you were a senior master sergeant in the Air Force, right? That's when you began experiencing those symptoms, and like you found ways to, I think, for like a lot of people with early onset Alzheimer's who are still working, right? You find ways to like compensate for the symptoms, right? Like how did you compensate for those symptoms, and at the time when you were still working?
I used a lot of sticky notes. I doubly wrote things on my calendar, put things in my phone because I was on call 24/7. I always had to be alert, but I couldn't, it was, if you made mistakes, then you could mess up someone's livelihood. So that's why I say I had a really good chief and a really good commander that if I messed up on paperwork or messed up on something or misspoke, they didn't beat me over the head. And I don't think a lot of people really knew I was struggling, but I was.
Right. And, at that time you were like around 40 years old, right? When you first had those symptoms, like, what did you think it was then? Like something's wrong, but like, what do you think was happening then?
Well, I was told by my primary care doctor at the time that it was stress. And they sent me to mental health, and mental health said, well, you're not you're not old enough to have whatever these memory problems. So it's stress due to your job. And then I had a VA doctor tell me that it was PTSD later. So for me, I knew I was stressed out, but the stress of messing up and forgetting things and having coordination problems and being moody, that is a vicious cycle because it stresses you out because you're messing up. But then they said that the issue is stress.
Right. So that must have been frustrating. Like you mentioned that like the mental health department was saying that it's stress, but you knew that it was there's probably something more sinister at play than stress, right? And yeah, so like what ultimately led you to the neurologist who ultimately diagnosed you with Alzheimer's then?
So when the antidepressants weren't working, I changed primary care doctors, and that primary care doctor sent me to numerous specialists. And they ruled out, diabetes. I did forget to tell you, I also saw a cardiologist. They ruled out heart problems. They ruled out so many things. They ruled everything out except the neuropsych and the neurologist are the ones that in conjunction, diagnosed me with early young onset Alzheimer's. But he took multiple brain scans, and it was the PET scan that came back saying that I had Alzheimer's.
So ultimately it was the neuropsychologist and the neurologist who did a series of different tests and found out that you had early onset Alzheimer's, and you received your diagnosis at the age of 42, right? And this was, and you retired just shortly before you received your diagnosis, right?
Shortly after.
Oh, you retired shortly after you received the diagnosis?
No, I retired, and then after, like 4 months after I retired, then I was diagnosed. But they had started the test while I was still in the Air Force.
Right. And yeah, I mean, at the age of 42, that's such a young age to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Like at the time, when you receive your diagnosis at the doctor's office, like how did you feel and how did you react to it then?
Honestly, I don't remember feeling much other than feeding off of his reaction, because when he pulled up my brain scans and the results of the PET scan, his whole demeanor changed, and he just seemed like really sad. And so I kind of fed off of that. And I think that with his words, I'll give you 5 to 8 good years, that spun me into a depression that lasted over a year after that, because all I could think about was later stages. And I just feel like I have a whole lot of life to get, to live. And I could not fathom, this giving into this, diagnosis within such a short time span.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people have the impression, like when people think about Alzheimer's, they think about, older people with the disease and in the later stages, and maybe they're in like nursing homes, right? And that's like our general impression, like the general public's impression of Alzheimer's, right? And so that must be like hard to contend with, right? Having that image in our heads.
Yes.
So, yeah. And your own grandmother, you mentioned, has Alzheimer's as well.
Yes, she does.
Right. So, you mentioned you went into, depression the year, like after, that year after you were diagnosed, right? Like that must have been a really tough period for you. Like also like you lost the structure of work, right? And that must have been really tough for you. Can you tell us a little bit about, how you were able to, cope with that, like not having not having that structure of work and being, having all your colleagues around?
It was difficult because, I don't think that a lot of people really knew how to react to the diagnosis. But then I had I have a core group of friends that have stuck around, through it all. But I had stopped volunteering with the Alzheimer's Association. I just totally secluded myself. It was very hard. It was a very dark place. And I feel like reflecting on that is what we should not do. We should not let ourselves stay in the dark places, because that's how we progress. Mm-hmm. That's how the disease progresses.
So how did you get out of that dark place? How were you able to, go find a brighter path after this diagnosis then? What are some of the things that have really helped you then?
Definitely my faith. My faith is my everything. It lifts me up. My faith in God just keeps me going. My faith in God tells me there's going to be a cure, that I'm going to be cured, that I'm going to survive this thing, and I'm going to live to be 86 or 89 or whatever, and still be in the stage. That's what my faith tells me.
Mm-hmm. So. And we also talked about, your work in advocacy, right? And that has been really important to you, and it gives you purpose too, right? Can you tell us about, some of your work, for instance, with the Alzheimer's Association? Tell us a little bit about, your involvement with the association and what you do there.
Sure. I'm an early stage advisory group member, and we deal with advocating with legislation. We help with research. We help with guidelines. We do it all. We shed a light on this disease, and we scream very loudly.
And is the group made up of other people also living with early onset Alzheimer's as well?
Yes, as well as mild cognitive impairments.
Got it. And it must be really helpful to be able to work with other folks living with the disease, right? Just to be able to relate to their experience. So you think that's made a big difference for you, just to be able to interact with them and see what life is like for them as well, right? That you're not alone in this journey.
Absolutely. I'm in a young onset support group that meets on Tuesdays with the Alzheimer's Association, and we're all thriving. We're all advocates in our own right, and we are living our best lives, as well as in my Black Dementia Minds group. We are living our best lives.
Right. And let's put a finer point on the Black Dementia Minds group, and because that's the National Council of Dementia, National Council of Dementia Minds that you're a part of, right? And that Black Dementia Minds group. And I did an interview with Brenda and Mark Roberts, who are part of that group. Tell us a little bit about the Black Dementia Minds group. What's the what does the group do? And
Well, we're a faith-based group of African Americans living with early onset dementias and MCI. We are transitioning from support. We support each other, but then we also advocate when we're given the opportunity. It's just a wonderful group, and we really rely on our faith and on our strength to lift us up and help us all like a family. It's great.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned is that you just don't see that many African Americans with Alzheimer's. It's hard to connect with them because they're just maybe they're not as aware of the resources. So can you tell us a little bit more about what your experience has been like in terms of connecting with other African Americans living with Alzheimer's then?
Well, it was through Brenda Roberts. I was on a Teepa Snow Facebook page. I think I made a comment there, and that was Brenda Roberts reached out to me and asked me if I would like to be a part of the Black Dementia Minds. But prior to that, honestly, in my other support groups of the Alzheimer's Association, we don't really see many African Americans. And I don't know if it's because their neurologists aren't telling them about the resources, or if they just aren't able to connect because of where they are, financial situation, whatever it is. But my neurologist told me to connect with the Alzheimer's Association. And honestly, I probably would have later, but had he not told me right off the cuff, then I probably, I appreciate him giving me that resource, because it started me, it opened the door for so many things, positive things.
Right. And you mentioned that, people in your support groups living with Alzheimer's or MCI, mild cognitive impairment, they're thriving. And I was wondering, like, from your observations of others living with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, as well as your own journey, like, what do you think is like some of the key factors or main ingredients to be able to thrive after after receiving a diagnosis? Because like you mentioned, there's you went through a really tough period right after a diagnosis. And Brenda Roberts, I remember she mentioned that, it's like a black hole after a diagnosis, right? You can enter a really dark place in your life. Like, so what do you think are some of the main things, the key things to do that can really help you live well with the disease?
I think the first one is having some sort of spiritual foundation, whatever that is, that lifts you up, that's greater than you, that will tell you that it will be okay. You need to have that. And then you need to have a purpose that is outside of yourself, bigger than yourself, whether it be volunteering at your church, whether it be living for your grandkids. You just have to have another purpose also. And also healthy living, like watching your diet, watching what you eat, get moving fitness wise, walk or go to the gym if you're still able, because I go to the gym, I get on the treadmill, because cardio health, if it's good for your heart, it's good for your brain.
That's what doctors always say, right? What's good for the heart is good for the brain too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So,
but I think those things, and minimizing your stress, because stress mimics, it just amplifies memory problems. So minimize the stressful life, have a peaceful life.
Right. So you really try to live like a healthy lifestyle, right? So
absolutely, overall.
Like a good diet too. You mentioned that you're making sure that you eat the right foods and stay active and staying social too, right? That's another important one too, right?
Absolutely.
Right, got it. And and you talked a little bit about your doctor, your neurologist, when he gave you the diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's. Like he had his demeanor was like very, like his demeanor really affected you in terms of like how you responded to your diagnosis. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like, how healthcare professionals like doctors and neurologists, how can they, give someone a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but also do it in a way where it can give patients and families some hope that it's not the end of your life right away, right? Because you mentioned that your neurologist told you that Nia, you probably have like 5 to 8 years of good life left for you, right? Like, how do you think professionals can do a better job in terms of being more positive despite the diagnosis?
I would say don't give people years, for one, because that is up to something greater than us, a power that's greater and bigger than us as to when we count our days. So I personally say just don't even give a person years, but tell them that they can thrive, and mention all of those things that I mentioned before. healthy living, the Mind Diet, Alzheimer's Association, being social, living a stress-free life, and getting moving. All these things can prolong and kind of ward off the progression.
Right. And I think another thing is also, you mentioned you have a core group of friends, right? That's definitely been important for you along this journey. But I think for friends, and I've heard this from other people living with dementia, is that, sometimes for friends, they don't know how to respond when they hear that a friend has received a diagnosis, right? It's just, they don't know what to say. I was wondering what your experience has been like with your own friends. Like, how did your friends or family respond to your diagnosis and when you told them about it?
Well, I think my best friend and my son knew that things were a little off with me. Like my best friend says, I have blonde moments. And so that's what we count them as, kind of space cadet moments. That's what we joke about. Yeah. But honestly, she's been growing with me because we talk probably twice a day because she's retired also. But, we talk about twice a day. So if there are things that I'm experiencing, she's kind of growing with me and learning about it. But, one thing that she has stopped saying, because I asked her to stop saying, is, don't you remember? Don't you remember? And I think people say that a lot to folks with dementia. And honestly, if we remembered, then we wouldn't be having the conversation. So saying, don't you remember? Don't you remember? That just is not very helpful. So using, our honest and open communication as friends, and with my son, my son had a hard time in the beginning with my diagnosis. I didn't think he understood that I had done, some really squirrely things, but I don't think that he really grasped the diagnosis until recently. And that's why I moved here. I moved to Idaho to be near him.
Right. And so you get to spend more time with your son and he can support you, right?
Yes.
And closer to him. Right.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned, you told your friend not to say, like, don't you remember, right? And so, like, how do you think friends can respond in a better way than if you have forgotten something, then how do you think they can respond in a better way that's more supportive and more positive than?
Just gloss over it. Honestly, just go with the flow. Go with the flow of the conversation, because sometimes it'll come back to us. Just not in that moment. But just saying, don't you remember? Don't you recall? No, that doesn't. I'm sorry, I don't. And it just, the more we say that we don't remember, it just makes us feel bad.
Right.
So I say, just kind of go with the flow of the conversation. Like, if I don't remember, then say, okay, well, then this is what happened, and refresh our memories.
Right. And, on that note, then, I was wondering, how about, right now, then, what are the day-to-day symptoms of Alzheimer's that you do experience nowadays?
A lot of times I forget things, like my attention span is very short. And I was food saving the other day, but then I vacuumed the whole house. And when I got done vacuuming, I saw that I had never finished food saving and I had all this food on the counter. So I didn't remember when I shifted from one state of being to the other. And that happens quite often.
And do you have ways in terms of to compensate and to cope with those symptoms and setting reminders or things like that, or you just go with the flow?
I just go with the flow with that. But with other things, I have reminders set on my phone for everything. I even have a reminder telling me to set my reminders for the next day. So I live by my reminders, but when things like that happen in the moment, I try not to beat myself up, and I forgive myself for it, because I know I mean, what can I do?
Mhm.
But just pick up the pieces.
Mhm. Right. To be forgiving to yourself, right? I think that for anyone that's we're so tough on ourselves, right? But some things are really out of our control, right? So we got to let go of some things, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Got it. Yeah, I think maybe to close off, is there any words of advice for folks living with Alzheimer's or folks who just received a diagnosis and is in that black hole that you were in when you were having major depression? Any words of advice or message for them in terms of looking ahead with some hope?
I would say that just it's okay to grieve, because we're naturally going to grieve our abilities. We're going to grieve things that our futures that we thought that we were going to have, because that was part of my process. Was I was grieving the fact that I wasn't going to be starting a second occupation after retirement, that I wasn't going to be doing prison ministry or working for a nonprofit. I was grieving that person. So it's natural to grieve, but just don't stay there. Don't stay there. Reach down into whatever spiritual base that you have that's greater than you, that tells you it's going to be okay, and really, really hold on to that. Really hold on to it, because it's going to be okay. And forgive yourself when it's not okay.
Right. Right. Because yeah, like we all have, aspirations and goals for our future, right? And you mentioned that, I'm sure when you receive your diagnosis, you realize that some of your hopes and aspirations for the future are likely not possible, right? And that's sad to think about, right? But you search deep down into yourself and look for that the what you believe in and your faith, right? That's been so important to you, to hold on to that faith, right? And find other things that are purposeful, right? You mentioned you're a professional volunteer now, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's important for you. So got it. Well, thank you so much, Nia, for sharing your experience and your journey living with Alzheimer's. Thanks for your insights.
Thanks, Nicholas. You're great.
My pleasure. And for our audience, if you missed any of this live talk, we'll have this video uploaded to our YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't yet. And thank you again for joining us for this live talk. All right. Bye.